We don't want to build on stress. We want to build from softness. How can we go back in? How can we clear out the noise to find safety within ourselves again?
What if the pelvic floor isn't something to fix, but something to listen to? In this conversation with Karina, we explore breath, pressure, digestion, and the nervous system, and how reclaiming softness and safety in the pelvis restores rhythm, vitality, and connection. See you in there.
Hey, Karina. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I'm excited to dive into the pelvic floor.
And how it relates to the whole reproductive system. Well, there are different ways I've been thinking about is one of the main things I teach when I teach anatomy is how anatomy affects physiology, or a simpler way to put it is container affects contents, right? So just geographically speaking, the pelvic floor is right underneath the uterus. And the pelvic floor has a lot of different functions, but the two I want to talk about mainly right now are how it holds the pelvis to the spine. So it's a structural or stabilizer muscle. And when it does, it's more in a contracted or toned and sometimes even tense state. And then also when we breathe, it responds to the breath, right? So that when the abdomen moves and the diaphragm moves, the pelvic floor is going to respond. So the pelvic floor is both a stabilizer and a mobilizer. And ideally, we have the benefits of both, or the best of both worlds. So when the pelvic floor is toned or tense, we can start to visualize or feel how that would have an impact on the contents of that region, right? So there's the bladder, the uterus, and there's the colon and the rectum there. And then what happens, for example, with digestion is another example. And the interesting thing with movement in the body is that there are a lot of different things that signal movement. Of the many things that I want to talk about is how things move from high pressure to low pressure. So visualize a contracted region is under high pressure, and then things that are lower pressure aren't drawn to it. So usually the higher pressure to lower pressure movement of the abdomen relative to the lungs is what creates the breathing. Though if the pelvic floor is held in a high pressure system, then the low pressure can't move towards it. And then the repercussions of that go in different directions. So I want to just stop there and see if that makes sense so far.
Totally makes sense. I just went to my pelvic floor specialist and she was explaining the exact same thing. Contents move the container and vice versa. Container moves the contents. And so what comes before, and I was talking to you about this, like the chicken or the egg, and you're like, the egg. But in terms of how things move in the body, it totally makes sense to me. We're not a fixed organism. We're a self-organizing structure, and we're constantly moving and mobilizing. Also, what's the word? Reestablishing relationship with ourselves every time we take a breath, every time we move, whether it's micro or macro. And so how these movements affect what's happening in our pelvic floor, in that lower abdominal region. And I love what you were saying about high pressure versus low pressure. If there's a lot of contraction, like how do we find, or how do we discover the breath, or how can we access the breath if it's so protected?
And so we can go back to our conversation about the sympathetic, parasympathetic, right? And obviously when we're in sympathetic tone, the pelvic floor is more under stabilizing mode or protection mode because it has to hold the pelvis to the spine, whether we need to fight or flight, and then adapted to this modern environment, of course. And so when we're in sympathetic tone, there's more pressure in that region and the breath can't move down, which means a lot of different things. One is the energy and the breath move more up towards the head, and we can start to understand, how the mind tends to take over when we're in stress mode. So that's one thing to consider. But also the idea that we need to be safe to reproduce, right? So this whole idea of survival to reproduction, when we're in sympathetic tone, we're in survival mode. And so it puts a pause or holds the uterus in place until it's ready to move again into reproduction cycles.
So I have a lot of questions, mostly about digestion in that area, because the colon sits basically against the uterus. And so if we are in sympathetic tone and we're unable to go to the bathroom because that's what happens, right? We like hold in our poo. We can't poo if a bear is chasing us. We're not going to stop to take a break. We're going to keep moving. So our physiology stops us from going. How does that impact the uterus?
Well, again, just think of rectum or colon that's full of content is going to increase the pressure in that region, right? And then the physical push or the physical pressure against just the amount of volume within a given space. So you can see how the sacrum moves a bit with its surrounding bones, but barely. So we can, just for the sake of this conversation, call it a fixed volume, the pelvic bowl. And then how much volume do we put in a fixed bowl? So the impact of the digestive organs, not just from the colon, but also from above, because we have the intestines, we have the stomach, we have all the other abdominal organs, which are going to be pressing down and increasing the pressure, which only makes this whole high pressure to low pressure contrast more important.
And then let's talk about inflammation, right? Because if something is full and things aren't moving, inflammation comes to help out the body, or it protects the body and says like, oh, something's happening here. We have to go and aid it. Yeah. So what happens to the uterus, to the cycle, and how do we support that?
Well, it exacerbates the amount of pressure, which goes back to what we were saying earlier. And then just maybe taking a step back beyond just the mechanical or the physical pressure is what I was saying earlier, is that there are different things that signal movement in the body. So one thing is high pressure to low pressure. Other signals are, biochemical markers and hormones and cytokines and so on. There's so much information moving, which will tell the body what to do. So then if you go back to the digestion and then to inflammation, in order to survive and reproduce, we need to be well nourished. So just to think on it on a logical, without going into the scientific, just on the logical level, we need to be nourished in order to nourish ourselves and to nourish the whatever will grow within us, right? Whether that's a baby or an idea, something that we want to put out into the world, let's say. So we want to be well nourished, and then with the digestion being blocked, well, we're not assimilating the same way. So that's one simple way to look at it. And then inflammation is the kind of the chicken and the egg, or the cause and effect of the stress hormones. So when we have acute inflammation, that's very healthy for the body. When we have chronic inflammation, that's a stressor in itself and will create a vicious cycle in the stress response, which will only tax the system even more. Taxing the system is taxing your energy, which means everything we eat turns into gasoline, which will only go to try and fix the problem of the inflammation versus nourishing the whole organism.
Okay. Wow, so much there, but I want to go back to the high pressure, low pressure system. So before we get into, getting condensed and having inflammation come to either help or protect the body, how do we allow space when the high pressure system starts to act?
Good question. There are a lot of different ways. So, the doorways towards the parasympathetic response, we can name some of those. But essentially what needs to happen is, I like to think of it almost like a kitchen sink. And the plug is making this water rise, right? And so you can think of the pelvic floor like the plug at the bottom of the drain. And all we need to do is pull the plug and the water will start to go down. Does that make sense? And so anything that will help relax the pelvic floor, whether that's abdominal breathing, for example, whether that's addressing a stressor in our mind, whether that's a hip opener, whether it's a reassuring connection with somebody. There's so many different ways that we can help relax the structure and the person living in that structure. And the more that we can address directly the pelvic floor, the more that's going to have the image of draining the sink, and then the pressures can equalize like they try to do with every breath that we take.
And so let's say our stomach is inflamed, does our container start to move so that it can change the volume in the breath? Or does the breath get stuck because of the size of certain organs?
You have both responses possible. So we've seen things like distended stomachs, distended abdomens. So that's one way that the container will adapt to the new volume. And with that, it's also affected because the tissues are less pliable because they've been overstretched. So it's going to affect the breath in that way. And then the other option, what you mentioned, is the breath will be affected. The lungs are pushing against too much resistance, and so they have trouble pushing down, and they'll continue to push up, which in turn is the breathing pattern we see in a stress response. So it'll be another vicious cycle.
And is there any way to bypass that and move directly to the pelvic floor?
Yeah, it's the same things I was mentioning earlier. So the pelvic floor is a stabilizer muscle. It stabilizes the structure. So we can play around with the structure of the hips and legs and how it holds the spine and head, for example. So playing around with the structure can have a mechanical or more physical release on the pelvic floor. That's one way. And then the other ways that I was mentioning is, when the mind is tense, the muscles are tense. And so can I move into what's causing the mind to be tense, reassure it, do some problem solving or stress management, and then release the accumulation of stress in the mind, which will then have a cascade into the body. And by relaxing the stress response, opening the relaxation response, it has an indirect way to relax the pelvic floor. Yeah.
I want to talk about the first takeaway of how to unlock the pelvic floor, and then I want to move into the latter. But the first question I have is what movements or what mobility would one require to open up the pelvic floor?
So you have a lot of different options, but the logical process of thinking of what would need to happen is, if the pelvic floor is a stabilizer, move the body in a position that it's not stabilizing itself. So whether you're on the floor, on accessories, something where the stabilizers don't need to work. As a matter of fact, none of the muscles need to work because they're all interconnected. So ideally, a fully supported posture, which will allow then the signal to relax those muscles. And then abdominal breathing, knowing that the abdomen relays the diaphragm to the pelvic floor, and that'll help equalize the pressures and the circulation in that region and the whole body.
So picturing shapes, so lying down on the ground, on your back, and also on your abdomen to help feel the breath move. Both can work.
Yeah, exactly. Lying down on the ground. I like having the knees bent because the pelvis is more neutral. I also like putting my legs up on a chair to help for different reasons. Yeah, and the lying on the belly is really nice if your lower back feels comfortable doing that.
Okay. And then the second part of the answer was that, if we unlock the mind, we can unlock the pelvis. And I think this is, let's open up the chest here.
Yeah.
Because there's so much in the underground of this. I feel, throughout history, women have been taught to not have a relationship with their pelvic floor. And so we disassociate very, very often from our feminine energy, our vital energy. And so, how do these two mechanisms work together, and how can we unlock the pelvic floor?
Okay.
As
As you said, it's a turbo test. So what comes to me first is the training we've had to hold our belly in, the bikini belly. So I think that plays a huge role, whether it's for aesthetic purposes or protection purposes. We pull the belly in. And a lot of the women that I work with and a lot of the women that I know tend to pull the belly in, if not all the time, most of the time, which will have all the effects we spoke about on the stress response. And then if we're talking about the pelvic floor, just to make it clear to our listeners, when the abdomen is contracted, the pelvic floor is contracted. So the pelvic floor mimics what the belly button does. If the belly button goes in, the pelvic floor goes in. If the belly button goes out, the pelvic floor goes out. And so we want that repetitive movement in and out, obviously. So there's that big topic, which I've only named the header of.
And I'm writing notes down because I want to ask you about this.
Okay. Then another big header, and we can explore, whichever one we choose to, is that, for a lot of history and a lot of different cultures, a lot of different religions, sex is taboo. And for a lot of our history, you only mate with the man you're going to marry and all those things. And so there was something about being the proper woman and how sexual relationships are improper and all the taboos that go with that. And obviously the emotions that associate those taboos, that there's something bad in my body. Yeah. As of children, even babies learn by contacting the sense of touch. They touch everything around them. This is how they inform the brain. This is how they form neurons. And as soon as the baby touches the pelvis, the parent is screaming after them, don't touch that. And so from the very beginning of our brain synapses, we're told, don't touch that. And so it's built in somewhere, whether our upbringing was then more liberal or free-spirited or whatever you want to have it. There's something built into don't touch the pelvis, right? And then, we can talk about nudity and stuff on another podcast. But just to consider those aspects, they're built into our social norms, and they're built into our relationship to our body. And now they're built into the tissues that create the tension around our health as a woman.
Whoa. I'm like jaw dropped, I think that you touched upon something that is so true, and it's like our first connection to it. We come out of it, and then we're no longer allowed to touch it, see it, feel it, any of it. So it's like our home is no longer where we can find safety. Yes. In fact, it's like we are like thrown out of it.
I was thinking they were like kicked out of our home.
Yeah, we're kicked out of our yeah. It's like once you're out, you're out. But I want to go there, but I want to talk about the Pilates portion of things, because as a Pilates instructor, I was always taught, you got to bring the belly button towards the spine. And I remember having a pelvic floor specialist in one of my classes many, many years ago. And she came up to me after and she offered me feedback. And I was like, always very gracious at getting feedback. And she's like, I really like your class, but I find I need breaks. My pelvic floor needs to release. And of course, my brain, my nerdy Virgo side was like, okay, I got to research all of the facts and all of the knowledge and all of the studies that have been on this. And so I love that you touched upon that, because in my classes now, it's like, we work for a certain amount of time and then we let go, we breathe, we allow it to move in its own proper organization of moving in the body. And so when it comes to teaching classes, hearing people, belly button to spine, hold, contract your pelvic floor, all these different cues, what is your take on that?
I'm smiling because this is the introduction to my training, so I'll try to briefly explain. So, general rule for any muscle, and then we'll get specific to pelvic floor, is I like to release, realign, and then re-strengthen. I don't want to strengthen on a tight muscle because I'm just going to be strengthening my tension and my compensation. And we know that a contracted muscle can't really contract, right? So it's only building tone or tonus, tension, rather than healthy strength. So as a general rule, what I like to do through the yoga therapeutics is we start by releasing the pelvic floor. Releasing the pelvic floor releases the breath and goes to all the other, relaxation responses that I mentioned earlier. So release the pelvic floor, get the body in parasympathetic tone, so all the muscular tone releases. Then the joints are more free to move. And then when you do your Pilates exercises, which is such a sophisticated system for body alignment, if the muscles are blocking the joints from going to where they need to be, we're not getting the most of our practice. So then as a general rule, I don't know how we can adapt this in a Pilates class per se, but just in theory, if we can relax the pelvic floor, do some belly breathing before and in between exercises, and the hip opening, feet stuff, all the things that connect to the pelvic floor. if we can balance out the strength and release, the class will be more efficient on the long run.
I love that. Yeah, I always start my class with breathing, with down regulation, because if you're coming into the class stressed, we don't want to build on stress. We want to build from softness.
And, I hope this can be clear without the demonstration with, an anatomy skeleton. Though when we're breathing only into the chest, so if our belly is tight, whether because we're doing it on purpose or for all the reasons I named already, we're holding our belly in, then our chest is the main mover. And when the chest is the main mover of the breath, we're actually tightening and shortening our spine. So mechanically speaking, we're not at an advantage for spinal alignment and freedom. So that we're actually tightening and tensioning and shortening our spine. And it's a stress response breath. And so going back to those vicious cycles, we're increasing the stress tone in our body, which is not the reason why we came to a Pilates class.
I agree so full-heartedly. I was thinking about, the mouth, anus, vagina, 3 openings of the body. And if we practice moving our mouth in all these different ways, we also have to practice moving our anus and our vagina in all these different ways so that we have all these, very nice, relaxed and toned muscles to be able to pass, to move, to release.
Indeed. So I think it'd be easier to enter this topic by understanding the digestive tube is one long tube between mouth and anus, right? It goes in one end, it goes out the other end. So that's the easiest one to visualize. More subtle, in my opinion, and always easier with the demo, is to understand that the pelvic floor contraction is a throat contraction. So I know that when I'm screaming, I'm scared,
You're tightening.
I'm tightening my pelvic floor, and that's increasing the volume of my voice, right? And then when I'm really relaxed, like everything just goes in, right? We know this from experience. And so the contraction or the tone around the pelvic floor is a reflection of the tone in the throat. So then if you bring this into your question about the mouth, and I like to include the sinuses as openings, even though I can only put my finger in so far to my ear, for example. So the movement and the placement of the tongue has a direct effect on the throat. We know that just from swallowing water or swallowing food. And then depending on, how tense I am, I'm going to have, my jaw clench and so on. And so how does the placement of the tongue and the muscles, not only of the tongue, but surrounding the tongue, and there are many of them, how do those shape the opening, which affects the shape of the pelvic floor itself? So there's a lot of methods, for example, craniosacral, that look at the cranium and the sacrum and their relationship, and there are many other practices and methods that look at that. What I want to touch on is this idea of the throat being our way to express ourselves, and how sometimes in the same way that we have to be proper, we have to hold our tongue, and we can't fully express our truth or our thoughts or ideas. And sometimes we hold tension in our throats, literally, which, affects not only the pelvic floor, but you got the thyroid there, and you have so many other functions moving out, in and out of there. And so how can we, again, use one point of entry to help address a bigger system or a bigger function?
Wow. I think it's so incredible to see the body as one connection and the pathways that we have from top to bottom, and not just see one specific organ or one specific opening as its own container. It's how do they relate to each other? And so let's talk about the tongue placement in the mouth. I would love to hear from a scientific background of what that actually does to not only our sympathetic and parasympathetic tone, but what that does in our pelvic floor.
So in my understanding, resting position for the tongue is on the palate behind the top row of teeth. And the key word there is resting position. Sometimes we hold it there with tension, and a lot of people actually push their teeth forward, because of the amount of tension there. There are a lot of exercises we do in the yoga therapeutics to relax the tongue and to bring it to the bottom of the mouth, and some sounds that can only come out if the tongue is at the bottom versus at the top. And then just understanding that there's a relationship with the pelvic floor, not only in the tone, but in the the placement of it. When you go into more subtle breathing exercise or energetic movements, if you want to bring the energy up, your tongue is in one position. If you want to bring the energy down, your tongue is in a different position. And just exploring from there, I think the idea that what I was saying earlier, it's one opening, right? It's there's one tube. And so if I can picture the tube like a hose, where am I placing the latch of the hose? And is the water going to go down this way, or is the water going to go down this way? And it communicates directly with the opposite end of the hose.
And so if there's a lot of tension at the top, the hose is going to constrict in one area or another. And then as I'm, my tongue is moving around my mouth because we're talking about it, I'm also thinking about the smooth muscle tissue in my cheek and how that is the exact same tissue that's in my vaginal walls.
Look at a cross-section of the two ears to the mouth, down the throat, and then look at a cross-section of the two ovaries to the uterus. Right? It's the same structure.
It's the antennas of our body. Yeah. And so let's go into the latter part of your answer of, how we were thrown out of our homes. It's like, when you're out in the world, our antennas, our ears, our nose, our mouth is seeing what's going on in the world. And when there's a lot of chaos around us, we shut down, we protect ourselves. We want to go inward to get away from the noise. And it feels like the same is true for our pelvic floor, for our uterus, for our ovaries. It's like if too much stimulation is happening, if we are not connected, if we don't understand it, and quote unquote, too much noise is like the not understanding of so many things. It's like we just close it down, we shut it down, and then we feel disassociated from it. And so how can we find that connection? How can we go back in? How can we clear out the noise to find safety within ourselves again?
Shortest answer is the breath. To go into a bit more theory to what you're saying, is the vagus nerve branches out right from the base of the skull, and its first branches are the ears, nose, mouth, and mouth, tongue, and eyes. And so in a way, we can think of the sensory organs as the antennas telling us, are we safe? Going back to this idea of survival reproduction. And so they're communicating directly through the vagus nerve to the reproductive organs and that whole region of the pelvic floor. If I have to run from the bear, I'm going to contract it. So the sensory organs are communicating directly to the pelvic floor to inform it if this environment is safe and secure and or, conducive to reproduction, or if I better just, stay in my cocoon until it's a bit more safe to come out again.
And then if we're disassociated from our pelvis, and of course there's layers to the hammock of the pelvic floor, right? And so the outermost is easy to kind of feel, maybe sensory experience. You kind of bring different textures underneath you to understand what's happening. But the uppermost layers, we really have to understand how they move, and we have to have some guidance within us. So if we're in a stressed state, can we even ever feel that layer of our pelvic floor?
It's a good question. The honest answer is I don't know. And then my most honest answer is the intelligence of the body is inherent with the wisdom of life, right? And so if we know that life is moving through us in the format of the breath, then can we just provide the breathing pattern, the breathing rhythm that's the messenger telling the body that it's safe, right? And so even if we don't understand, I'll open up the question, even if I don't understand how the brain synapses work or how the tricuspid valve, blah, 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 right? I don't need to know all that, whether I study it or feel it. I just know that if I'm breathing in a way that tells the nervous system that it's safe and I behave accordingly, then the systems know how to take care of themselves. So as much as I'd love to answer your question with more precision, I'll go back to saying I really don't know. And do we really need to know?
That makes sense. It's like some things, are left to the mystery of the darkness inside of our body. I think I asked the question because, you know, when you think about like singers, they really understand the craft of the mouth. And maybe we're not all singers, but we all have sex. Yeah. And so, you know, the more you understand your own anatomy, the more you understand pleasure. Right. And so if you're having sex, whether, you know, whoever's entering your body, like, what is informing those tissues and how can we co-create instead of just have someone put in the energy? You know what does that make sense?
Yes. So I'll risk suggesting, because it hasn't been proven or there's different schools of thought, that we can feel the viscera. I feel in my body that I can feel my viscera. I can feel when I'm gliding my kidney up or down, or my liver, right? And get different schools of thought. So, you know, everybody cross-check my information. So I feel that we can. So when I can at least. And so when I'm inhaling, I could feel my uterus pushing down on my pelvic floor. And so through going back to the previous question, to understand that when we move the pelvic floor down, the bottom of the uterus actually opens up. The cervix opens up, the aperture increases. And we understand that when we're exhaling, then it closes, which makes sense because I'm going to close off against any foreign, you know, pathogen or danger. So to go back to this idea of co-creating, when we're in a connection, in an intimate relationship and enjoying the sexual act, how can our breath help open up the cervix and allow not only what's moving in, but then what's circulating through the spine? That's the cerebrospinal fluid then goes all the way up to the spine, to the top of the head, and then circulates, which is one of the bases of Tantra, right? And so you use the breathing alone and or with your partner ideally, and you both have the circulation of energy from the root up the spine through the top of the head, which, if we're going to elaborate on this, through the top of the head is complete bliss. And so you transform the sexual energy, which is the most creative energy in the world, the creative force to create the bliss you want to feel through the breath.
Okay, so what I'm understanding is unlock your breath.
Unlock the bliss.
Unlock the bliss. Who cares about all the anatomy terms?
Unlock the breath, unlock the bliss.
Okay, and so coming back to the very beginning of this conversation, do you think then that it's vital or important for people to feel their pelvic floor? Or I'm gonna ask again, the entry point to unlocking breath, is it first by understanding the different diaphragms of the body, or can we simply start by breathing?
Ideally, we can simply start by breathing. Ideally, when we attempt to, everything in us allows it to move as it will, as it should. When there's a resistance, a blockage, some misunderstanding somewhere in the body, then it helps to understand anatomy, which is why I like to teach it. And just to understand what's happening on the inside can then not only satisfy the mind, but inform the mind to help guide or accompany the movement.
So if all is well, simply breathe. If there's a kink in the wire, first understand the wire.
Yeah.
Understand the why behind the kink, and then simply breathe again.
Exactly. Like if you want to ride your bike, you don't really need to know the mechanics. When your bike breaks down, it helps to know how to fix it again.
Yeah. I love that. Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah?
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really fun.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.